Professor Mudde, it is our pleasure having you with us at our conference, and I hope that we will have a productive conversation, starting with a new phenomenon, as it seems that pandemic has acted as a catalyst of the emergence of irrational behaviors. Science denial of the very existence of the virus, denial of vaccination, denial of mask use. A new social identity seems that has emerged, that of pandemic deniers. How do you explain it?
So I think it is mostly rooted in an anti-government/anti-state position, which comes from a variety of different positions. On the one hand, it comes from populists, mostly on the right, but not exclusively, who are against the state because they distrust it and they think it's corrupt, etc. And so this is in line with a longer ongoing process. Another one is, I think, a consequence of pretty much the neoliberal era and this kind of libertarian position of egocentric position of people who just think, well, it doesn't affect me, so I'm not going to do this. They only think in the individual, not the collective. And then there is a kind of an anti-statism on the left, which has a longer history of anti-vaxxers among, let's say, the pro-natural kind of movement, the yoga crowd, which actually also often has a fairly libertarian strength. So there are two elements here. One is just the general populist, anti-establishment, anti-elite view, and the other one is more libertarian, I can do whatever I want, my body, my choice kind of thing.
So from what you said, it seems that these irrational attitudes are cutting horizontally the traditional left-right dichotomy. For example, in America, we know that anti-vaccination is related with Republicans. In Greece, mostly with the left. In other countries, it comes both the left and the right. Your comment, please.
Yeah, I think overall it has been predominantly with the right, but certainly not exclusively. So, for example, in the US, it has been very much polarized by Trump and the Republican Party. And as a consequence, part of the anti-vax, anti-mask movement now is more about being in support of the Republican Party than necessarily related to the mask. But we also know that in parts of California, for example, among more liberal people and higher educated people, they're also anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers. What I've seen so far is that in most cases, the bulk of the people in the street, at least in most countries, are of both the far right and some just conspiracy theories, which are not just about vax, they're about 5G, they're about all kind of different things. If I would guess why in Greece it is particularly on the left, I would say two reasons. First, you have a right-wing government, and second of all, you have a more militant left than most other countries, which is more anti-state. But again, as far as I know, in few countries, it is the left where it is predominantly anti-vax and anti-mask.
So this guides us to a broader question. This left-right distinction is enough in order to explain phenomena of this pandemia and the denials, or it is something which acts like a kind of historical anachronism?
Well, traditionally, the left-right is most useful with regard to socioeconomic issues. nowadays a kind of a different left-right is pretty clear with regard to immigration, identity issues. But there are many issues on which the left and right distinctions are not as clear. And if you particularly talk about hostility towards something, then we often find people from the left and the right in terms of anti-state movement. I do not, however, think that this is a new cleavage or even a new dimension. I think as soon as the pandemic comes down a little bit, that these current alliances will pretty much falter beyond some really hardcore conspiracy theorists.
Most liberal democracies, Professor Mudde, have treated the anti-vaccinist movement rather gently. Do you think that this should change, especially after measures announced by President Biden, also by President Macron and other political leaders, or what is needed is these people to be convinced?
There should be a combination, really. I mean, a lot of the research that I've seen shows that the majority of the unvaccinated in many countries is not principally against it, but is hesitant about it. Obviously, we should try to convince those, but we also have a sizable hardcore of people who don't want to. I think, at least for those conditions, and I think in most countries the conditions are that we need vaccination rates above 80%, if not 85%. And if that can only be achieved with force and mandate, and I think it should be. However, I think if countries have, without a mandate and without force, reached, let's say, 85, 90%, then it might not be worth the trouble. I mean, in the end, this is a means to an end, right? We don't necessarily care whether people believe vaccination is good or not. It's not about those people. It's about all the people around them. And if we can protect all the people around them and they choose to risk dying of a disease that they could easily survive, then I think that it's fine as long as they don't harm other people.
Are you thinking that after pandemic, we are going to have a shake-up in the political landscape in some countries? I'm asking you this question because in some countries in the Balkans, such phenomena have already appeared. In Romania, a party out of nowhere gained 9% at last elections with main promise to stop vaccinations, to stop using of masks, etc. Something similar seems to happen in Bulgaria. Are you thinking that we will see such political parties in European countries?
I would be very surprised. So, I mean, particularly Bulgaria, but to a certain extent Romania too, but particularly Bulgaria has been kind of in this whole period of new government, anti-government movement, which overthrows the government and then has no alternative for the next one, which means that the next one is facing a similar type of movement. I think at the moment the vaccination is just used for a general kind of anti-establishment movement there. If you look at the polls have been remarkably stable in most countries. There have been some shifts. But even if you look at the last election in a country like Norway, the environment was more important than COVID. I think what COVID does more than really create new parties or significantly change the dynamics of existing party systems is that it has pushed most mainstream parties a little bit more back towards the state. After decades of neoliberalism, there is now this understanding that the market cannot solve everything and that the state needs to be involved in certain things. And so I would imagine that we see a little bit more state involvement and state investment but I don't think that we will see new type of politics.
In this landscape, is social democracy having any kind of raison d'etre, or it is again an anachronism?
Well, it's of course when you get one or two results that go the same direction, then everyone starts to speak about a trend. And so, given that in Norway the left has won, although the Social Democrats lost slightly, as earlier in a sense also in Denmark, and now of course SPD is polling very well in Germany, we get this whole movement of, well, the left is back. But I think that's a bit debatable. First of all, social democracy itself in many countries still very weak. The left is still very weak in countries like the Netherlands or in France. But social democracy and left-wing politics, to a certain extent, have a lifeline, because the healthcare system is back on the agenda, and on that specific theme, the vast majority of people support an active state. And so, with topics like that, the social democratic parties, but also more left-wing parties, actually have an advantage over right-wing parties, because the market as a mechanism to solve major issues, particularly of this type of nature, a pandemic, is simply not as positively seen as the state. But again, it will depend on the specific country, and I don't necessarily foresee like a new golden era of the left. Rather, what I see is that the mainstream right and right-wing parties will be less anti-state on some welfare issues.
So, speaking more broadly, are you thinking that at the end of the day, liberal democracy will be able to absorb the shock of these last 2 years?
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
you are a supporter of liberal democracy, although you are very critical on some aspects.
Yes, of course. But in the end, even though I think political elites do a terrible job at explaining what liberal democracy is and why it is the best system, with some notable exceptions, and those in and by themselves are, of course, very important and very sad. I mean, Hungary being the worst, Poland following closely. Liberal democracy is still the main form of political system within the EU. It will remain so. What the crisis, I think, shows is that the political agenda should be broadened. It has been incredibly focused on issues like identity, security, immigration. It's clear that a very large group of people are concerned about other things, which include like jobs, unemployment, pensions, and healthcare. And that will hopefully make parties more responsive, and therefore liberal democracy a little bit stronger. But we have to be able to deal with the fact that we have a sizable portion of the population that is anti-state, distrustful of governments, irrespective of who is in government, and that believes conspiracy theories.
These ideas, these perceptions, which is best way to face them and to react? Is it at the end of the day a struggle about hegemony in a certain society?
Yeah, like me some hegemony, but I'm not totally sure how far I can get with that. I think we have depoliticized politics, particularly during the neoliberal era of the 80s, 90s. And as a consequence of this, we have not really convinced people why the policies that we support should be supported, why they are better. And this should be part of politics. Politics is not just administering. Politics is about ideas. And I think that what we as broader politicians, as supporters of liberal democracy, have to regain the trust and the support for the system from a sizable portion of the population. I do believe that we can, and of course there will be a percentage that doesn't believe it and doesn't want to believe it, and that's fine. That has always been the case. There's nothing new about it. What is much more important is that politicians win the trust again of people, and you do that first and foremost by coming across as competent, and by explaining why you do what you do. And both of these we have been lacking in over the last decade.
Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation, Professor Mudde. Let's hope that at our next conference, pandemia will not be the main issue.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Petro.
Thank you very much. Thank you.